Well, good day, everyone. My name is Chris Bertram. I'm the Senior Director of Applied Neuroscience here at Exos. And today I'm going to be guiding you through this webinar entitled Flow State for Athletes. And what I'm going to do is focus on what I consider to be the most interesting and maybe the most important topic in the current world of high performance, and this thing called flow state. And I want to start by telling a bit of a story about how my career and my professional life intersected with this concept. So, along with my role at Exos, I'm also a faculty member at the University of the Fraser Valley, and I've been here for about 20 years. And my primary academic area of interest is in the world of skill acquisition, or how we learn new skills. And I would say for about the first 10 years of my career, it was very traditional in that we looked at things like how you set up learning environments in such a way that it produces the desired outcome, which is to be able to ultimately perform under pressure, right? Something that we call stress resistant learning. Learning isn't that interesting when it only shows up in a research lab. We want it to show up when the pressure is on and the stakes are high. And so, we would do things like talk about random practice and block practice and that sort of a thing, and how to optimize the conditions of learning. And that was, that's kind of skill acquisition 101. And then I would say one day, this goes back about 10 years, I was reading a research article and it was on learning, and it showed that this one of the groups in the experiment had a sort of a flow state intervention done prior to the learning task. And what they were doing was trying to solve some puzzles, right? And what they found was that this group that had this flow state intervention learned the task and was able to complete the task successfully anywhere between twice as fast and 5 times as fast as the control group. And I can tell you, when I read that, I thought the first thing that came to my mind was that's probably not real. That's probably just an accident or a fluke in research, because I've been doing this work for a very long time. And when I would find, and when people in skill acquisition find effect sizes in learning, it's usually like incremental effects, right? And we celebrate that and we publish it. But I can tell you that it's never double. And it certainly isn't ever 5 times as fast for one group as it is for the other. So this really got my attention for two reasons. Number one, I thought, is this a real effect? And so I looked around in the literature and I found a few other examples of where it actually showed up across a few different experiments. And I thought, okay, well, that's something. And then I thought, well, what on earth is a flow state intervention? Because at that point, my understanding of flow state was very different. And so that started an entire new avenue for my career. And it turned everything that I do, both academically and professionally, on a dime. And it really started to inform my academic work, but it also started to inform a lot of the work that I do out in the field with world class athletes. And so we're going to go through this today and we're going to talk about flow state. And I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what the current state of the science is, at a high level. We're not going to get too deep into the weeds, but there will be a bit of terminology here today to get through. And then we're going to talk about, how it is that we can bring this state of consciousness called flow around with some intention. Because if you are sitting out there like I was about 10 years ago, I thought this was just something that happened sort of magically every once in a while. And, Kobe Bryant goes off and shoots or scores 81 points against the Toronto Raptors and that sort of a thing. And it wasn't seen as something that you could do on purpose. And so we're going to talk about, again, start with the science, work through some of our understanding of what is happening inside the brain and the body when flow state comes around, and then work towards some actionable steps that we can take as practitioners and coaches in the real world to help bring this around with some intention. Okay. So, first step, we're going to do a bit of a dive into the science of flow. So, when people ask me about flow state these days and say, what is flow state all about? I usually say that it depends on, which sort of scientific field you want me to answer that from. And we'll take it from two different angles. And the first one is the field of psychology. And so in the world of psychology, The person who actually coined the term flow and literally wrote the book called Flow was a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he was a person who was not necessarily interested in athletes per se, or creative type people or performers who sort of are, you might expect them to find this thing called flow more often. He was actually just doing a global study on happiness. And what he was interested in was, what is it that happens to people when they feel at their best? What are the lived experiences of people when they feel they are at their absolute peak in life? And what he did was he ended up going around the world, and he did talk to athletes and he did talk to world leaders, but he also talked to everyday folks, assembly line workers. And what he found was that no matter what you're doing in life or what your profession is, when we feel like we are at our best, the same anywhere between 7 to 9 characteristics tend to show up. And there are things like this. When you are in a state of flow, you're very highly concentrated on the task at hand. There's a very clear sense of purpose and a very clear goal. There's this strange transformation of time, where sometimes time goes by very slowly, or sometimes time really expands and opens up, and we have a lot of time, it seems like, to move around in time in a very strange way. There's also this sense that your sense of ego or your sense of self and self-consciousness starts to go away. And we feel this, overwhelming sense of connection and connectedness when we're in this state. And there's a couple of other things too. Obviously, when we're in flow, there's this sense of ease and effortlessness to it. So it just sort of seems like everything is happening very easily, and one thing is kind of flowing into the next. It's actually where the term came from, this fluidity of thought and action when we're in flow. And the other part about it that's really interesting is that he called it an autotelic experience, which just means that it's intrinsically rewarding. When we are in flow, we want to stay there and we want to get back there, not for any external reward, but just because it feels so good when we're there. So it just drives us based on the pure fact that it is an enjoyable experience. So he came up with these characteristics, and that was a huge help, right? Because prior to Csikszentmihalyi, the terms that you would hear that were synonymous with flow, before that was the term, were things like the zone or runner's high or that sort of a thing. And that was fine. Like, when I used to teach classes on this, and we would talk about concepts like the zone, you know, I believed in it. I'd seen it on display. I'd certainly felt it in certain parts of my own life before, but there was nothing you could do with that really as an academic, because if you had ever asked somebody, what was the secret when you had that magical performance today? Like, what was the secret there? The answer you would invariably get is, well, I don't know. It just seemed easy today. Well, there's not a whole lot you can do with that, right? And there certainly wasn't the neuroscience around at the time to really help us look inside the brains and the bodies of people when flow state was around. And so, again, as an academic, there was very little we could do with that other than just think, well, that's just magic when all the stars line up and this amazing performance sort of emerges from us, right? So Csikszentmihalyi's contribution was really important in that it gave us some language, and it helped us to understand that flow is not just the domain of athletes, and it's not just the domain of performers in any aspect of life, but it's really there for everybody. And that's a really interesting thing, that no matter what, those same 7 to 9 characteristics tend to emerge when we get there. So the psychology was the first step here, but where it really started to get interesting for me is when the neuroscience started to catch up. So this, I would say in the past 15 years, there's just been an explosion in neuroscience in terms of both our understanding of what's happening inside the brains at various times, including flow. But there's also been this amazing explosion in technology that's allowed us to peer inside the brain when we're going through certain experiences like flow. And when that started, when the neuroscience started to catch up with some of the psychology, things got really, really interesting. So I want to sort of do a high level overview of some of the neuroscience of flow and talk about what's really happening underneath the hood when flow state comes around. And so to do that, we're going to talk about three basic areas here. And the first one is just in terms of the anatomy of your brain and what is actually happening, what's active and what's not active when we're in flow state. So, first of all, I'm just going to go back a little bit and say that there's this old idea around how your brain works that, maybe we're only using 5% of our brain most of the time, but maybe when we're at our best, that, the whole brain comes online, right? That is not the case at all. And certainly when it comes to flow state, it's actually the opposite of what is happening. So when we get into flow, there's a very interesting pattern, not of activation necessarily, but deactivation. And specifically, there is deactivation in a part of your brain that sits right here behind your forehead called your frontal lobes or your prefrontal cortex. And this thing that happens has a pretty heady name. It's called transient hypofrontality. That is the experience and that is the anatomical change that accompanies flow state. So I'll break that word down or that term down a little bit just so it's a little bit more digestible. Transient just means it's temporary. Hypo means there's decreased activity, and the frontal part just refers to the frontal lobe. So transient hypofrontality. When we go into flow, the frontal lobes of the brain start to deactivate. And that was a fascinating finding because if you know anything about the frontal lobes of your brain, they're very important for us as human beings. They do a lot of really important things that help us in the day to day world, and they certainly were very powerful and useful for us in a survival context. They do things like provide us with something called executive function, which is a whole series of functions that your brain does, our human brains do, which is things like, the ability to do abstract problem solving. Willpower is a function of executive activity in the brain. It sort of gives us oversight of what the rest of our brain and body is doing. All very useful tools, right? But it turns out what is very good for us in terms of survival is not very useful in a high performance context. And so, this part of the brain that's really involved in thought and problem solving at a conscious level starts to go offline when flow state comes around. And there's some other things that are going on in your frontal lobe that are really, really interesting that feed back into some of those experiences that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And an example of that is our concept of time. So, as human beings, we have this very interesting relationship with time. For example, right now, if I were to ask you what the time is, you'd probably be able to ballpark it fairly closely, right? Or sometimes if we have to get up to catch a flight or something, we have to set an alarm for really early in the morning. A lot of times we just wake up a minute before the alarm goes off. So there is that element of time, and the frontal lobes are involved in that calculation and that prediction. But what I'm actually talking about is time at a bigger scale, specifically the difference between the past, the present, and the future. Now, we as human beings have a very unique ability to time travel inside of our own heads, right? Now, again, very useful for survival. Like if I look out the window, let's say, and it's the fall and you see leaves falling off the trees, I would know from the past that that means that the weather is going to change. So maybe I would think, maybe I could plan for the future. Maybe I could, put some food away for the winter or make a blanket if the weather's going to start getting cold. Our understanding of the past and our ability to plan for the future was very important for our survival over the millennia, right? But again, what's important for survival is often counterproductive when it comes to high performance. So if I said to you, where does performance anxiety come from for athletes? Well, very little of it is happening in the here and now. If I just talk about anxiety across the board, where does that come from? Well, typically it comes from one of two places. Either you're looking back and remembering things that maybe went badly in the past and dragging that forward into the here and now, or you're worrying about things that have yet to happen, or the consequences if I don't succeed. How's that going to affect my career or my paycheck, right? Thinking back, ruminating about the future is really the root of anxiety, specifically for athletes, right? Now, the amazing thing about flow state is that when it starts to come around, the very part of your brain that does that calculation for you is starting to go quiet. And so you're literally incapable of doing that time travel when you're in flow. And all you're left with is the here and now. There is this sense of being very present and very focused on what you're doing. And again, there's biology that's going on that's driving that experience. So time becomes very altered, right? That's one of those characteristics of flow, this strange sensation that time passes very quickly or time slows down. Another thing that happens in your frontal lobes that is really, really interesting here from an athletic standpoint is that our sense of self starts to vanish too. And when I'm saying that, what I'm talking about is really two things. Like, first of all, there's this sense that, my head is over here and your head is over there, and your mind is operating over there and mine's over here. There's a separation between self and other, right? That's part of it. But there's also the physical self too, like my hands are here and this screen is here in front of me. And then I feel this separation between subject and object, right? Now, when we go into flow and the frontal lobes start to go offline, that sensation that we have, that sense that there's a separation between self and other or subject and object, also starts to dissolve away. And so when you think about how this comes to life for an athlete, if you have a golf club in your hand, let's say, and you're swinging this golf club and you're really, really good, or you're a professional, let's say, you don't necessarily feel that there's a separation between your hand and the golf club, right? It almost becomes an extension of your person, right? And then if you think about team sports, right, where there's like, I've got my object over here and there's another person over there. When we starting to get into this group flow, it's almost like our minds start to become one, and I can predict what that person is going to do next. And this amazing connectedness starts to emerge in flow. So that's one of those key characteristics of flow, that sense of self and self consciousness starting to go away. And again, that's directly related to this idea that your frontal lobes are shutting down in flow. The third and final thing about your frontal lobes that's really interesting here is it actually is the seat of our inner critic. There's a part of your frontal lobe right over here on the side, on the lateral prefrontal cortex, and it literally is the seat of your inner critic. And the way we know this is literally by putting people into fMRI and scanning their brain and having them tell really negative stories about themselves. Like, tell us a time when, you really blew it and you let some people down. As soon as you start telling yourself that story and you hear that narrative going on inside your head, this part of your brain gets really, really active. And that also happens to be one of the parts of the frontal lobes that shut down when flow state starts to emerge. And so frontality, hypofrontality is one of those key characteristics that we know is associated with flow. And then the lived experience of that is this sense of freedom, right? This freedom from time, freedom from the past and the future and worry, and a very strong sense of being present for the task at hand. So that's the first part of neuroscience that's relevant to flow state. There's a couple of others. The second is that your brain's electrical patterns actually go through a really interesting transformation. So believe it or not, your brain is an electrical organ. You can measure it, you can put electrodes on your head, and you can listen into the electrical activity that's coming off of your brain. And it tends to come off in these pulses, right? These waves that come off, right? And they come off in a certain, frequency. So as we're sitting here having this conversation and you're listening to what I'm saying, if you're paying attention, there's a very good chance that your brain is giving off about 20 of these pulses or waves per second. It's called a beta wave. That's very highly correlated with everyday waking alertness and consciousness. The other end of that spectrum is what happens, say, when you first wake up in the morning. You've got these very slow and lazy waves coming off the brain, maybe between the range of 1 to 3 per second, right? Those are called delta waves, and they show up in deep sleep as well. And all across the spectrum, there's different kind of experiences, right? Sometimes we feel kind of daydreamy and meditative, right? Sometimes we get very excited and anxious and the waves get going really quickly. Well, one of the things we know about flow state is that when flow state comes around, your brain kicks into a very stereotypical pattern, and it's right around 10 of those pulses per second, or 10 hertz. And the reason that we know this, by the way, is if you actually scan the athletes' brains when they're doing their thing, right? Performing their skill. At the start, maybe they're kind of floundering around a little bit and kind of getting into it. But then all of a sudden it clicks for them, right? And they start doing their thing at a really high level. What happens is the brain finds this very stereotypical rhythm. And we know that this is the rhythm of flow. Now, why that's interesting and how this is actionable, we're going to get to a little bit later. But for right now, I just want you to understand that these electrical patterns that are emanating from the brain start to change and find a very stereotypical rhythm when flow state comes around. So that's two things, right? That's two things so far in terms of the science of what's happening inside your brain. And the third one, and the final one, has to do with the chemistry, the neurochemistry of flow. And this is probably, in terms of what really is driving the experience and what's driving this change in our perception when flow state comes around, it's a good chance that a lot of this has to do with the neurochemicals that are coming around in this really interesting cocktail when we get into flow state. And there's 5 of them that we know at this point are highly associated with flow state. And I'm going to go through them kind of one at a time, and then we'll talk about why those things matter. The first one is something called norepinephrine, or we can just call it adrenaline for the sake of ease. It's basically the same thing, and it has the same effect on our brain and body. There's something called dopamine, which you might have heard of as the molecule of more. It's a reward chemical that makes us feel really good when it's around. There's something called anandamide, which is one of our endocannabinoids, these internal cannabinoids that we have. That shows up when we're in flow. There are endorphins that come around. And endorphins are the things that most people kind of associate with runner's high. Endorphins are the things that kind of dampen our perception of pain, right? Allow us to keep pushing through. And then there's a 5th molecule that seems to be intimately involved with flow state, and it's called serotonin. Now, why this particular mix? And I'll try to put this into some language that I think is a little bit more kind of common knowledge, right? All of these 5 chemicals that we have inside of us actually have an exogenous version too, or something you could buy and take, right? Something that comes from outside of us. So if you think about adrenaline as an example, right? So that's one of the front end flow chemicals. Adrenaline's main purpose in the brain and in the body is to drive a sense of agitation and readiness. So when adrenaline hits the brain, it drives a tremendous amount of focus into what we're doing right here, right now. Adrenaline, as you probably know, is associated with that fight or flight response, right? Whenever something comes around that it's a perceived threat, we get this dump of adrenaline. And what it does at the level of the brain is drive focus. Okay. So I said that's the internal, the endogenous chemical. Things like Adderall, things like Ritalin, and are all kind of derivatives of amphetamines, right? Those chemicals, when we take them from outside sources, basically mimic the internal natural response of adrenaline. It sort of ramps it up to a pretty high level in many cases. But if you think about why it is that, say, Ritalin is prescribed for kids that have attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder in many cases, one of the things that those drugs do is they drive focus and they allow kids to be more focused, right? Adrenaline has the same effect. When it comes around, the brain gets very focused, but it also has an effect in the body, right? Adrenaline tends to jack up heart rate, it jacks up your blood pressure, and it sends all the blood that might have been, digesting food in your core, and it sends it out to the muscles and readies us for action, right? So there's a saying that we have in the flow world, which is that flow follows focus. And the focusing chemical that largely is at play here is adrenaline. Now, I've had the opportunity in my career to work with some athletes that we might call adrenaline junkies. Like I work with some big air snowboarders, and people always ask, like, what is it like to work with adrenaline junkies? And I very much say to people that that's not actually the appropriate term, because adrenaline is not exactly an enjoyable experience. It's agitating at its core, like it's a readiness signal. But that's not what these people are in it for. It's the things that come after we have the readiness signal. So we have the focus and the energy that adrenaline provides. But on the back end of that, when flow state starts to really get ramped up, is we get some of these feel good chemicals like dopamine. Dopamine is that reward chemical, right? It gives us that, when we're in pursuit of something and we feel like we're on the right track, our brain is getting a lot of dopamine. And then ultimately, when we arrive and we successfully achieve a goal, we get more dopamine. It's chemicals like that that are the things that, athletes, especially, high risk action adventure kind of athletes, those are the things that they're in it for, right? The feel good chemicals. So it might be better to say that they're more like dopamine junkies, right? Dopamine is also the chemical that is involved heavily in any kind of addiction, right? Gambling addiction, drug addiction, they all play very heavily on the dopamine system. So, flow is a state of excitation and focus and agitation, which is coming from adrenaline, but it also feels good, right? And that's what dopamine does. That's somewhat what anandamide does, that third chemical. But there's also this sense that we can keep going and we want to just keep pushing through. And that's what those endorphins are doing for us, right? And I just want to say that endorphins, we hear a lot about them, but I think they're sort of undervalued as in terms of their intensity and what they actually bring about. So if you like, one of the main endorphins that comes around in flow is something called beta endorphin. And if you isolate that chemically, which you can do, you'll find that it's actually 100 times more potent than medical morphine. These are not trivial neurochemicals, right? So when we talk about, the ability to push through and we just keep going, we don't even notice the pain of an experience. A lot of that is being mediated by some of these endorphins that show up in flow. And the last one that I talked about was serotonin. And serotonin is a really interesting molecule that exists inside of us. And it also, again, can be taken from external sources too. Most antidepressants play on the serotonin system. They're calming chemicals. So when we have a lot of serotonin around, we very much feel like, everything's okay in the here and the now. And that's a part of the flow experience, right? It's high energy, it feels good, we can keep pushing through, but at the same time, we feel as though we've got this, like we're in control of the situation. And so that, it seems, is largely due to the influence of serotonin in this other, rather interesting and complex cocktail of neurochemicals. So that's the neuroscience of flow. Part anatomy, part electricity, and part chemistry. Now, with all of that said, I want to just talk about something that's really important. It's about the kinds of intensity of flow experiences, because I think when people hear about flow state, they generally think of it as, the athlete winning the gold medal or the team winning a championship, or those moments in our life where we just feel like we are at our absolute peak. Now, those are flow states, but what we call them are macro flow experiences where you get all the triggers, you get all the neurochemistry coming in this amazingly powerful dose. So that is a flow state. But here's the amazing thing that we know now. Flow state is not just that one thing. It actually exists on a spectrum, right? Like any kind of experience that we have, like happiness. We can be a little bit happy, or we can be ecstatic, or we can be a little bit agitated or aggravated, or we can be really, really angry, right? Emotional experiences have a spectrum, and flow experience has a spectrum as well. And the great thing, and this is probably the most interesting thing that's come in the last 5 years, let's say, is that we now know that micro flow experiences can be leveraged to great use. So if we go back to where I started this conversation with that story where I explained that, that group had that flow state intervention, they learned 2 to 5 times faster. Well, if you're like me, you were probably thinking, well, what was the flow state intervention? Again, I didn't know what this was at the time. Well, I can tell you this. When you look into the methodology of that paper, what they didn't do was push people out of airplanes and have them parachute into, the Super Bowl halftime show and have, endorphins popping out of their eyeballs. That is not what they did at all. What they did instead is they used some technologies called TMS. And what it does is it shoots a little magnetic pulse into the brain. And what you can do with that is selectively activate or deactivate certain parts of the brain. And that's what they did. They selectively deactivated parts of the frontal lobes, again, driving some of that hypofrontality. And that is all. And the amazing thing about this, and I've had it done to me, is that you do not know that anything has happened to you. There is no change in the way that you feel. You don't feel like you're having the greatest moment of your life. It is virtually imperceptible to your lived experience. And yet, even with that, they were showing increased rates of learning of 2 to 5 times, right? So you think that's only one part of flow, that hypofrontality. What if we could do something like that and activate that process? Plus, how can we change the electricity of our brain? Or how can we add to the neurochemical cocktail inside of our brain intentionally? And maybe we can do all of those things simultaneously and start driving people into flow at an even larger and more significant level, right? Starting to see where we're going here. So before we get to sort of the how-tos of this, I just want to spend a couple of minutes and talk about why this matters, right? Obviously, there's the part about, athletes having, the performance of their life, Tiger Woods winning by 15 shots at the US Open, or, all the amazing things that Michael Jordan did, right? Under those competitive situations, flow state is undoubtedly playing a big factor. But if we look inside the training environment where we're trying to drive skill acquisition, it can be more subtle. Nonetheless, it can be profound. And so if we think about why does flow state matter, and how if we start priming the brain for flow in the context of a training or a practice setting, we can see these supercharged rates of learning. And hey, look, athletes are in the learning game. Any coach is in the skill acquisition game. It's what all of high performance is at its core. And if we can drive some flow state into the situation in advance, we are going to increase the probability rather dramatically that the gains that you see as a result of training or practice are going to be elevated. So the learning effects of being in flow are significant and should probably be getting a lot more attention, I think, than they are currently. So the learning effects are part of it, but that's not the only thing that happens when we're in flow. So there's some really interesting research looking at reaction time, or how quickly you can respond to a stimuli when you're in flow versus when you're not. And as you might guess, that when we are in flow state, our ability to respond to stimuli goes way up. So why does that matter? So, I think the obvious example there are sprinters or anybody who has to respond to the sound of a starting gun. Getting off the blocks or getting, off the diving platform quickly is in the interest of those kind of race athletes, right? Responding to that stimuli really quickly and getting going very quickly is really important. But reaction time actually goes well beyond that, right? If you look at a baseball player who's able to check their swing as they see at the last split second the pitch is diving out of the strike zone, and they're able to check their swing, that is still a reaction time. They're responding to a stimuli in very quick order. Now, when flow state is around, we are able to do that more quickly. And the other thing that happens that is related to reaction time is, again, some of those snowboarders that I work with, they get up in the air and they're, hitting an 80-foot jump and they get a little bit off axis. And if they land a little bit short, they're going to have a big problem. Or if they land on their side or on their head, obviously they're going to have a very big problem. So their ability to be aware of what's happening with their body internally and their proprioceptive mechanisms and to react and make corrections on the order of milliseconds is really, really important, both for performance, but also for injury prevention, right? So reaction time, yeah, it's really important to get off the line quickly for certain athletes, but it really is across the board. Reaction time is a critical part of performance. And when we are reacting in a state of flow, we're able to react much more quickly. Another thing that really is a benefit and a huge benefit of flow state is that you see these massive spikes in creativity. And you think, well, these are athletes, right? These aren't creative types. But if you think about, what it is that makes the best athletes of all time so special, it's their ability to connect pre-existing dots in new ways, right? It's what Wayne Gretzky did in hockey. It's what Michael Jordan did in basketball. It's what Kelly Slater's still doing in surfing, right? It's doing the things that people were doing previously, perhaps, but in a very different way. That is the essence of creativity. And when we are in a state of flow, creativity goes through the roof. And here's how we know this, by the way. So there's some really interesting research on certain musicians, like jazz musicians, improv jazz musicians, right, where they're just kind of making it up as they go, or rappers, freestyle rappers that are just making that up as they go. They've actually taken people in those categories of music and put them into fMRI and watch what happens inside their brains. And it's fascinating. So what they see is that, say, a jazz musician, when they're playing, a memorized piece of music that they know off by heart, you see one thing happening in the brain, but then you tell them to start improvising and being creative. And all of a sudden, all these interesting changes in the brain start to emerge, like the frontal lobes going quiet and the inner critic going quiet. And that creative process is actually triggering a flow state. So creativity is a great way to sort of both trigger a flow state, but once you're in a flow state, it's also where creativity really starts to ramp up. So it's this really interesting mix of something that you can do with intention, be creative, seek creative outlets as a means of pushing you towards flow. And then once you're in it, those creativity rewards start to compound, and all of a sudden we're doing things we just didn't know we had in us, and these amazing performances can start to emerge. So creativity is a really huge benefit of flow. And then obviously the last one, which we're not going to focus on so much here today, is the elements of performance, right? In competition. If you think about all those neurochemicals and all those electrical changes in the brain, when you're in a competitive environment, you're standing at the top of that run and it's the Olympic Games, or, it's the bottom of the ninth inning in the World Series, there's a very different mix of neurochemicals that are going on due to the magnitude of the moment. And how we channel flow in those moments is also a really interesting thing, but we'll save that discussion for down the road. What we're really talking about here is how we can prime flow when there's otherwise no environmental conditions around to help push us in that direction. So the last part of this I want to talk about is how we get there, right? Because as we said at the start, prior to, not too very long ago, flow was just seen as this magical, fleeting state that sort of sprinkles down on some people in certain circumstances. And then it just kind of evaporates, and we don't know how to kind of hold on to it, much less drive it into being in the first place. But what we now know, because we understand those basic mechanisms of hypofrontality and those basic electrical patterns in this neurochemistry mix, we start to have some windows into how we can go inside the brain, not literally, but through some behavioral practices and some tools and technology to activate those very mechanisms with intention so that we can start driving flow state on demand. So, what I'm going to do here is just go through a few examples of things that you can do in practical ways to bring about some of these changes that happen when we know flow is around. So, that first one, by the way, around those changes in the frontal lobe, you want to know how to do that? Well, there's some really interesting research that's come out in the last few years around exercise, of all things, right? Of course. So here's what we know. We know that if you just go out and do some mild to moderate exercise, after about 18 to 20 minutes, you are going to be driving something called exercise induced hypofrontality. So this is literally going out for a walk. That's the intensity that we're talking about here. Just going for a brisk walk after about 18 to 20 minutes will start to drive those changes in the frontal lobes that we know are associated with flow state. 4 to 6 minutes of intense exercise gets you there too. So those of us who are in this world of high performance and are active people know this to be true, but maybe didn't understand or have the language to explain what it is that sort of changes in us when we're really kind of, out for a great walk, especially if there's these other triggers around, which are, if you're in nature, let's say it's a really big flow trigger. When we get out and we're active and we're moving our bodies, or if we're really pushing it really hard in intense ways, that all of a sudden you start to feel connected and focused, and your inner critic is starting to go quiet, and time is passing very quickly in some cases, right? That is because those very activities are driving the changes that are associated with flow. So just moving is one way and one thing you can do to help prime the brain on the front end to move us closer to flow. That's one thing you can do, but there are others. So if we think about the electrical patterns of the brain, right? I said that when we are in a state of flow, our brains move from this kind of very fast moving wave and slow down into this really interesting rhythm that's right at the borderline of two other types of waves called alpha and theta. Now, if I say that to you, what on earth could you possibly do with it? I'm going to show you a quick video here of how I use this and how you might be able to use it too. So this slide is showing an athlete that I've spent some time working with. She's on the Canadian national snowboard team, and she's wearing a headset that has one electrode on it, and it's right on the front of her brain. So it's listening in for these electrical pulses that are emanating from her brain. And what I told her to do was to picture a time in her life recently where she felt that she was at her absolute best. She's a snowboarder, so predictably, the experience was a snowboard experience, but it wasn't competitive. I believe it was something along the lines of she'd had a recent day where she was out with some friends and it was clear blue sky and it was fluffy, powdery snow, and she was just making these big turns. And that was like her best moment in recent memory. So I said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to close your eyes and I want you to visualize that experience. But I said, don't just visualize it, like, don't just see it, but remember how it sounded. Remember what the snow felt like underneath your board and the cold air moving past your face. And remember viscerally how that experience made you feel. So she closes her eyes, and about, I don't know, what is this, 4 or 5 seconds later, this starts to happen. So that's my hand off screen, and I've got this drone helicopter. And there are no special effects here, there's no remote control here. That helicopter is literally being flown by her brain when she shifts her mind from those fast moving beta waves into this alpha theta range. So when she uses visualization as a tool, she shifts the state of her brain. And by the way, she didn't know she was trying to do this. It was the first time she'd ever tried to do it. And what it demonstrated for her in real time is that she has the ability to shift her state of consciousness, right? She's able to self regulate from a state. Look, when we first started this, I had somebody holding an iPhone. There were people standing around watching. She was very nervous. Her brain waves were going very, very quickly. I can see this happening in real time. I have a tablet that's showing me this. But as soon as she starts to get really deep into this memory, her brain waves start to shift. And as soon as they find the wavelength and the frequency that we know is associated with flow, that drone starts to fly. And in an instant, she knows that she has the ability to shift her mind there when and wherever she wants to do it. And of course, there's a protocol that gets built out from this. And so it takes a bit of practice, like anything, it requires reps and time. But I can tell you that it is teachable and you can learn how to do this. And if, look, I understand that not everybody out there has this technology, but what it speaks to is the power of visualization and the ability to just will yourself into a better state of mind. And it is real. And the more you do it, the more you sense that change inside of your mind as you're doing this, the more acquainted you will get with how that feels. And then you can call upon it under moments of stress or moments of low stress. Like, it's a Monday and it's training day. We want to be in flow because we want to drive those changes in learning and progression, right? And the way you do that is by stacking up some of these flow triggers. So maybe we've got a bit of movement first. Maybe we do a bit of visualization. But there's other things we can do too. And this gets to that third category of the neuroscience, which is about the neurochemistry of flow. So as I said, there's adrenaline and there's dopamine and a few other things. Well, how can we bring that about with intention? And it turns out there are a whole host of ways that we can drive some of this neurochemistry with very simple, free, and low tech tools. And I'll give you one example of this. Some of you are probably following the high performance literature these days as it pertains to breath work. And there's so many amazing things that are coming out these days on how we can utilize our breath consciously to drive these really interesting neurochemical changes in the brain. And one technique that does this really well within the context of flow is something called box breathing. So if you've heard of this before, you might know that it was a technique that was designed by Navy SEALs for Navy SEALs. You think, well, why would Navy SEALs be doing breath work? Well, first of all, if you don't know what box breathing is, I'll quickly explain it to you. It's just following along a breath pattern that goes around four sides of a square. So you might inhale for 4 or 5 seconds, then you hold your breath across the top for 4 or 5 seconds, then you exhale 4 or 5 seconds, and then you hold at the bottom of your breath for that same amount of time, and then you just keep going around and around. Something really interesting happens. Actually, a few interesting things happen when we breathe in this pattern. And here's what it is. So, when you inhale, the mind doesn't think anything special is going on there. That's just regular breathing. Take an inhale, fine. And you hold a little bit at the top, and that's not overly stressful for 4 or 5 seconds. Then you exhale again, which is completely normal. It's part of our normal breathing pattern. But then you do something interesting. You make a decision to hold your breath when you've blown out all of your oxygen, and you hold across the bottom. As soon as you do that, your mind says, what's going on here? I'm supposed to be inhaling right now. Am I being held underwater? Am I being choked out? What is going on? And what it does in response to that is it gives you a dose of adrenaline, right? Focuses the mind, energizes the body in case you actually are underwater and you need to claw your way to the surface. But you're not. You're choosing to do this, right? And so you're getting that adrenaline burst. And that is a very powerful tool, right? And by the way, you don't just have to do this for 4 or 5 seconds. Some of the athletes that I work with on this will actually do it for 10 or 15 or even more seconds per side. It might be subtle at 4 or 5 seconds per side, but I can tell you this: when you get up into the 10-second range and you're blowing out all your air for 10 seconds, then holding, the feeling of adrenaline becomes very apparent. And we're doing it again on purpose in order to drive focus, to energize the body, and get us ready for action. This is why the Navy SEALs found this to be an effective tool. And then there's one other thing that happens. So by way of choosing to kind of ride out the bottom side of the box there, when you get to the point where you actually get an inhale, you actually get a bit of dopamine. You get a bit of a reward for making it across the bottom. So you get adrenaline at the corner here, you get some dopamine over here when you give your body back some oxygen. And now you've got two flow chemicals moving around in the system, right? So if you think about this in terms of protocols, you can think about ways to drive quietness into the frontal lobes. You can think about how to use visualization and other tools to move the electrical pattern into the range that we're trying to get it into in flow. And you can do other techniques like breath work patterns that will drive the neurochemistry of flow. And it's not just breath, by the way. Just moving your body in interesting ways elicits some of these same neurochemicals, particularly movements that engage your vestibular apparatus. So anytime that you're sort of put off balance, like if you're using a balance board, or if you're putting your head upside down in certain yoga poses, or you get weightless and you're swinging your body back and forth, the vestibular apparatus plugs directly into parts of the brain that release adrenaline and dopamine. And so we can use novel movement patterns as a way to trigger some of the release of these chemicals too. And over time, the message here is understanding those mechanisms, playing on those same mechanisms using simple or sometimes technologically advanced tools, but stacking as many of those triggers as you can prior to doing the work so that we're going to see some of those elevations in the rate of learning, those speeding up of reaction time, those increases in creativity, and ultimately those really otherworldly performances that we see show up when athletes are at their absolute best. And so there's one last one, by the way. This is probably, it's a whole list of flow triggers. I think there's up to about 22 of them now. The one that gets overlooked the most is the one that usually, if you look up what flow triggers are, the one that gets overlooked the most is having a very clear goal. If you notice, when we started this almost an hour ago, I set out some very clear objectives and set the goals for this session. I do that on purpose because what I'm trying to do is get everybody on the same page, understand where we're going, and that can be one of the triggers to get us into maybe a group flow. At the individual level, it matters just as much. So when you're training or you're practicing, having a very crystal clear goal of what you're trying to achieve is very, very important, right? Here's the example I always use for people. If you've ever gone into meetings, and who has not had this experience, go into a meeting sometime and you're sitting there 25 minutes into a meeting and you have absolutely no idea what the purpose is, right? This happens more often than not. And it's because, at least primarily because, so few people start meetings by saying, okay, folks, here's the goal for today. Here's how long we're going to be here for. And here's what we're going to get out of this. That doesn't guarantee you're going to get into flow, but it's a necessary precondition, and it certainly helps to prime the system so that if there's other flow triggers moving around, that we might be able to catch it. Flow is not a game of certainty, it's a game of probability, and it's played best when you understand the mechanisms and you understand the triggers, and then you stack those triggers up, and then you go and you do the work. And so that's hopefully a good overview of some of the science. So I'll just take a couple minutes and summarize where we've come today. We started with that overview of the current state of flow, what we understand about it from a scientific level and a psychological level. We described the differences between macro flow experiences and micro flow experiences, which are still, although sometimes very subtle, very powerful tools in performance and learning, right? So we did that. We talked about all of the benefits, or at least a good handful of the benefits that can be of use for athletes in terms of learning and reaction time, creativity. And then we talked about a few tools that you can use in everyday practice to start doing your own version of a flow state intervention. Hope you found this information useful, and we'll see you again soon.